Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cost of Cuts, the economic fallout of SNAP reductions, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center. I'm Steve Hayward, Communications Manager at FRAC. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few brief housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 60 minutes. We are recording the presentation and will send the recording and slides in a follow-up email. Closed captioning is available. To turn captions on, click the Show Captions button in the bottom taskbar and select English as the spoken language. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. To ask a question at any time, please use the Q&A tab in the bottom taskbar. With that, I'll pass it off to Gina Platanino, SNAP Deputy Director at FRAC. Take it away, Gina.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you all of you who have taken the time from listening to the riveting words and testimonies that are happening right now. As you are aware, for those of you who may be new to this world or are following, today the House Agriculture Committee continue a second-day markup on this portion of the budget reconciliation. After the pause for votes earlier this afternoon, the session is expected to resume and continue into the evening. So while this process may seem procedural, the policies under consideration, as all of you have been seeing, will carry very real consequences, especially for SNAP, Medicaid, education, all of these programs that help the safety net of America. For SNAP specifically, the proposed legislation will cut approximately $290 billion over the next 10 years. And that's not a routine budget decision. It's a dramatic chance to fundamentally dismantle one of the most effective anti-hunger programs in the country. Democrats on the committee have voiced strong opposition and proposed 69 amendments to mitigate the damage. However, votes have largely fallen along party lines, and many deeply concerned remain in the bill. Let's walk briefly through what's at stake. First, the bill restructures the way SNAP is funded. Today, SNAP operates as a federal entitlement, meaning the federal government covers 100% of the benefits, of the food benefits, and shares administrative costs equally with states. Under this proposal, starting in fiscal year 28, states will be required to pay at least 5% and up to 25% of benefit cost, depending on their error rates. This shift, historical programmatic shift, will mean that as of today, 28 states and territory, based on current data, will be forced to shoulder 25% of SNAP benefit costs. At the same time, the federal match for administrative costs will cut down to half, meaning that states will have to pay 75% of administrative costs. This would push a massive cost burden onto states, especially during times of economic prices of groceries, shelter, and other basic needs constantly climbing up. States were going to have to make impossible choices, raise taxes, cut other critical services, or reduce SNAP eligibility. And this will leave families, especially those already struggling, without the support they need. There are other incredibly harmful provisions, like capping the thrifty food plan, expanding time limit to individuals, shifting the way that dependents work. So no longer dependents being exempted if you have a child under 18, but now it has to be under 7 years old. All of these are terrible, terrible consequences, and I will put in the chat our analysis about this. But today, really want to focus on the experts who know about budget, who know about fiscal policy, who will be able to really talk to us of what this means in real life. So really excited for our panel of speakers. And our first speaker is the City Controller of Houston, Texas, Chris Hollins. Chris was elected in 2024 and serves as independently elected Chief Financial Officer for the nation's fourth largest city, managing a $6 billion budget, $6 billion investments, and $14 billion in debt. Driving transparency and fiscal responsibility, using audits to improve efficiency and championing smart governance to protect vital services in Houston's most underserved area. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And to begin, as we have just talked about this huge, dramatic proposed reduction, Can you help us understand the economic and fiscal impacts on these cuts through the lens of a local city like Houston? And if you could speak specifically on how these reductions in SNAP and other benefit programs are likely to affect local economies, fiscal stability, and public services.
Absolutely.
Turning it over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you to the organizers, to my fellow panelists as well. If you don't mind, Gina, I want to talk a little bit about the big picture, and then I'll zero in on what's happening here in Houston. So look, when we talk about SNAP, we're not just talking about a line item on the budget. We're talking about a real lifeline. SNAP helps working families, it helps children, it helps our seniors. And people with disabilities are also being helped to afford their basic human needs, which in this case is food. In Harris County alone, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, over 620,000 people rely on SNAP to keep food on the table. And again, that's not just a number. These are parents who are looking after their young children. These are seniors who are on fixed incomes, who are trying to stretch every single dollar. These are workers who are trying to stretch things out already to make ends meet, and oftentimes still falling short. SNAP is about giving these folks a fighting chance. It's about making sure that these children are going to school without an empty stomach. It's about making sure that parents can pay for groceries that ultimately allow them to pay for other things like rent, like medicine. And it's about boosting our local economy as well, because these dollars ultimately flow through community stores, small grocers, and local farmers. And so, that's why we need to make sure that these proposed cuts by Republicans in Congress, as well as Donald Trump, that they're not viewed as just cruel or mean, that they're economically reckless. They are slashing a program in the middle of an affordability crisis. And it's not just going to hurt these families who depend on it for their everyday needs. It's going to hurt our entire community. And so let's talk about our community, the one in which I live. So I mentioned before, 1 in 5 local residents here in the Houston area rely on SNAP. And again, that is not just a number. It's not just a statistic. That's hundreds of thousands of families who are trying to get by. And on average, SNAP participants receive, roughly $200 a month for groceries, which is, of course, upwards of $2,000 a year. And that relief, that $200 that they're not having to spend on food, allows them to pay rent, allows them to afford medicine, allows them to afford childcare, transportation. And so this isn't a luxury, it is a necessity. It keeps these families from having to make impossible choices like, do I buy food for tonight's meal, or do I buy my life-saving prescription? Because when you start to ration these things out, you're denying yourself health care that ultimately increases the cost of the system for everybody else, while of course lowering your lifespan and making quality of life in general worse across the board. And so these consequences go far beyond hunger. What starts as a challenge around food can very easily spiral to something bigger. A family's falling behind on rent. That leads to an eviction. That leads to homelessness. Without proper nutrition, because you're siphoning off your own meds, your health declines, higher medical costs at the ER, more pressure on the local hospital system. And when more people are pushed to desperation, homelessness, then you see crime go up. You see instability go up in our communities. As families lose their homes or businesses see fewer customers, cities like Houston collect less in property and sales taxes. That means more strain on our budget. That means less resources to go towards public safety, to go towards schools, infrastructure, and other critical services. And so, one, this isn't just about numbers. There are people behind these numbers. But two, it's not just about these individuals or their families. It's about the entire economy in the city of Houston, which is 2.3 million people, in Harris County, which is around 5 million people. These proposed cuts lead us into a vicious cycle where less food security leads to worse health and housing outcomes, leading to more strain on public systems and less revenue to meet the rising demand that is, basically demanded by these shortcomings. And so, I'll end on this. SNAP dollars aren't just helping people to eat. It's helping communities to thrive. That money gets spent in our neighborhoods. It supports local businesses. It keeps families afloat who oftentimes are already working 2 or 3 jobs to make this whole thing work. And so pulling that support now in the middle of this crisis is fiscally irresponsible. And if Congress is serious about strengthening families and reducing poverty and promoting economic resilience, then cutting SNAP is the last thing that we should be doing. And so, we need to be investing in people, not just from a moral perspective, because it's the smart thing economically. Thank you all so much.
Chris, thank you so much for bringing it down at a level that it is about people, is about human, and just really expanding that SNAP doesn't operate in a vacuum. It touches all segments. We're going to continue on with Mark Fankhauser. He is the president of Fankhauser Associates and the former mayor of Kansas City, Missouri. He is a longtime public sector leader. Mark served as mayor during the Great Recession and used performance as a founding member of the Association of Local Government Auditors and former governing magazine publisher. He brings a deep insight into fiscal accountability and the real-world consequences of budget crisis. Mark, thank you for being here. You've worn multiple hats: city auditor, mayor under difficult economic times. How can we draw from your past experiences to understand the real-world impact these cuts will have on local economies and government budgets? And what lessons can we learn from previous cuts to benefit programs and proposed cuts so that we can raise awareness of the risks that these reductions pose to economic stability, public health, and long-term fiscal health at every level of government?
Thank you, Gina. I'm happy to be here. I want to answer your question by teeing off of some of what Controller Chris Hollins just said. So the absence of the SNAP benefits, the significant cuts in SNAP benefits, are essentially cuts to the resources in the community in a very broad way. And so what happens is that this is a detriment to the local economy. It's money that isn't available, that can't be spent, that can't be recirculated in the local economy. And almost certainly, this kind of stress on families that are already very stressed is going to lead to crime and instability. It was already the case. I wrote an article 2-3 months ago that the cities were facing what I called the mother of all fiscal cliffs. There are a convergence of forces, including the loss of the ARPA money and so forth, long-term costs for infrastructure that are putting cities in financial stress already. Big cities like Los Angeles and small cities across the country are facing a very difficult financial situation. They're dealing with problems like homelessness and affordable housing, and those sorts of things are all going to be exacerbated by these cuts if the cuts occur. And I want to highlight another point that Chris made, which is that many of these people are working. There's a measure called ALICE, Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. Many of the jobs that have been added over the last several years are very low wage jobs. People cannot make enough to support themselves, even with full-time work. And so the pressure is going to be on all these families. And when there's this sort of pressure on the family, economic pressure, you can't, you don't have enough to eat, you can't pay the rent, you can't buy medicine. What this does is put very big strain on the relationship between husband and wife, between domestic partners, but between the family and their children. There's going to be negative impacts on kids. And we're going to pay for those impacts. We're going to pay for them for a long time. children that are don't get adequate attention from their parents because their parents are stressed. The parents are working several jobs. They barely are able to keep things together, so they're not getting enough attention from their parents. They don't have necessarily enough to eat. They're insecure. They're anxious. There's a whole another acronym, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And there's lots of evidence that these adverse childhood experiences reverberate throughout the life of the adult, whatever he or she experienced. Well, this is going to increase those. So this is not just a moral issue, and it is a moral issue, but it's not just that. It's an economic issue. I mean, cities that are struggling with managing homelessness, cities that are struggling now with issues like affordable housing, cities that are trying to control what we call public disorder, domestic violence, that sort of thing. Those problems are all going to get worse. And for people in the city who aren't directly touched by these, who aren't, for instance, food insecure, who aren't at risk of homelessness, it still negatively impacts their quality of life. It makes it more difficult. You know, nobody likes to walk down the street and see homeless people. Nobody likes to know that there are hungry people all around them. That's not, you know, for normal, regular, sort of middle and upper middle class folks, the quality of life in their community is going to be negatively impacted here. The fact is, we all sort of share the same space. We all live together, and it's I really worry about the impact on cities. What cities have is what is sometimes called a common pool of resources. In other words, it's the parks, it's the streets, it's the libraries, it's the public places, and it's the amount of money that they have, all the income of all and the assets of all the community is shared in paying taxes and paying fees and so forth and taking care of the community. That's all, you know, income's going to go down and costs are going to go up at a time when finances are already fragile. And then when you look at the impact of the other things that are going on, like the changes in tariffs, I understand that the current administration has changed direction on tariffs at least 50 times in the brief 3 months that it's been in office. This is I want to emphasize that this is bad news. It's really bad news for the people directly impacted, but it's actually bad news for everyone in the community. And it's bad economic news for those of us in government who are trying to balance budgets and make ends meet. And I'll stop there, Gina. I'm going to be, at this point, I would just repeat myself. This is not a good thing.
But it's true, Mark, and it's simple. And I thank you for calling it cuts. I know that right now we kept hearing the House committee saying they're not cuts. It's just like you can call a lion an elephant, it's still a lion, regardless of what you call it. And I really appreciated you saying that this will impact everyone in our community. Next, we're going to hear from Danielle Scott, who is the director of PFMed's Management and Budget Consulting Practice and the co-director for the Center for Budget Equity and Innovation. There, she specializes on equity-driven budget and financial planning. She's led operations and recovery strategy in major cities like Houston and Harris County, Texas, as a core contributor to the National Resource Network and federal recovery efforts. Danielle helps city implement sustainable community and center fiscal strategies. Danielle, thank you for being here with us. Considering Considering the work you do in this space, how do you see these reductions impacting economically challenged cities, particularly those with high poverty rates and fragile budgets? And what are you hearing from local governments about the immediate long-term effects of these cuts? You're muted, Danielle.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate everyone and the commentary, especially the question. What I'm seeing across the country from working with local governments, big and economically challenged and much smaller and rural places is a lot of the same story. Places that have seen sort of the rebound of post-COVID-19 in the years post-2019 and 2020 are really starting to see the impact and the shift in the economy moving from booming sales tax, much faster growing property taxes, and starting to really feel the impact even without the major cuts to federal funding, like key programs such as SNAP and some of the other programs, exacerbated by some of the items that some of the other panelists have shared with the ending of ARPA programs and the American Rescue Plan Act. Those dollars helping to make sure that key critical programs and that new programs that were supporting these vulnerable populations were in place are now not only losing funding, but there's, I think, a broader question on how can we continue to support these communities. I think what we're seeing across the board is that as budget constraints, fear of losing these longstanding programs continues to be high, the need to evaluate revenue options at the local government level continues to sort of exacerbate that problem, and the correlation between the economic uncertainty, fear of job loss, as well as reduction in these programs is really fueling this need to figure out how residents are able to maintain essential spending. And from a local government perspective, as local governments are working to sort of navigate these budget constraints in real time, as well as sort of the softening of the economy broadly, how can they maintain these essential programs, and recognizing that these impacts at the local government level are going to have a ripple impact across the board. I worked recently through HUD's Technical Assistance Program, Distressed Cities and Persistent Poverty, working with a small rural place in Georgia last year, where the cash flow situation in that particular community and county was so dependent on, stable numbers in property tax, stable numbers in sales tax. And so as those dollars are starting to dwindle and continuing to fluctuate with the broader changes of the economy in recent months, the impact of seeing those SNAP benefits and other federally funded programs that are supporting vulnerable populations sort of continue to exacerbate in very ways that our other panelists have articulated, where folks are having less dollars to put into the economy, have less able to pay essential bills, utilities. Those impacts are seen at the local government level. And for a community like the one I'm referring to, but for many communities where local governments are a major employer and an economic driver, having those potential cuts continue to have ripple effects with local governments struggling to maintain budget levels as well as essential services. How can they continue to keep essential people and maintain sort of their role as an employer in the economy is very much a key aspect, is sort of the down-home impact of something as fundamental as a SNAP program, and seeing that the sort of continuous ripple effect on how you're going to see the cyclical nature of these cuts show up, not only for the individual families that will be losing these critical benefits, but also for local government's ability to maintain key services, to continue to invest in infrastructure, to continue to maintain programs and quality of life measures that residents and stakeholders have come to rely upon as a means of ensuring high quality of life, supporting education outcomes, as well as serving, the most vulnerable populations that are already starting to feel these cuts. So I think across the board, there's an urgency to make sure that not only as we're looking at the impacts on the individual families, which is high and urgent, but also thinking about the broader implications at the local government level, particularly for economically challenged and smaller municipalities across the country, where these places were already at the brink with budget constraints and issues in supporting and providing essential services, that the ripple effects of these cuts on the broader economy on property taxes, on sales taxes, and their ability to maintain their position as an employer as well as a provider of services is extremely important. And so I can't say it enough that, any of these loss of federal programs that many of these communities, residents, and institutions have relied upon will have much broader impacts on the economy as well as quality of life, even beyond just an individual family's ability to pay for their food and to provide essential services. Will this have an impact on youth programs going away, or homeless services going away, or your pothole being able to be filled? So I think there's just such an impact that I don't think folks have been able to clearly see and recognize that it's not just one family and one sort of set of the demographic population that would be impacted by these cuts.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm gonna keep my video off because I keep getting notifications that my Wi-Fi is not being that great today. But thank you for saying that. It's those potholes, it's those services that we take for granted, but incredibly pivotal. Our last speaker to really put everything together is David Eichenthal. He is a former senior advisor at the White House Domestic Policy Council and at the U.S. Treasury, my former office mate. So good to see you, David. David, besides working in this very demanding roles, brings 3 decades of public sector experience. He previously served as an assistant city controller and finance officer and led National Resource Network, which provided technical assistance to over 60 economically challenged cities. His work spans government, the nonprofit sector, and consulting, focusing on fiscal resiliency, performance management, and equitable city planning. David, given the scale of the proposed federal cuts to SNAP, and the historic bipartisan understanding of the program as both a social safety net and an economic stimulus, how should we frame the role of SNAP today as a driver of local economy stability, public health equity, and fiscal resiliency? And what are the broader implications for the relationship between Washington and state and local governments?
Gina, thanks. It's really an honor to be part of this panel. I'll start by just saying I agree with everything that Controller Hollins and Mayor Funkhauser and Danielle just said in terms of the way to think about SNAP as both this moral obligation, right, to combat hunger in communities across the United States, but also this important economic and fiscal role that it plays for local communities. The work that I've just started to do as a visiting research scholar at the Center for Urban Research at CUNY is really starting to focus on the last part of your question, which is really about the relationship between local governments and Washington. And I think it is important to think about where we've been historically. And there used to be a time that I'm old enough to remember where there was actually bipartisan support for different programs in Washington. So there was this thing that in many ways was sort of the precursor for ARPA, federal revenue sharing. There was actually a Republican president's initiative, and it was put into law by a Republican senator, Howard Baker, and a Democratic Senator, Ed Muskie. SNAP, the precursor of SNAP, food stamps, went through a major expansion in the late 1970s. The 2 champions of it were Bob Dole and George McGovern, who 5 years earlier, one was the chair of the Republican Party and the other was the Democratic nominee for president. But we've really over time seen this extraordinary erosion of support, particularly among Republicans, when it comes to programs that were part of this federal, local, and federal, state, and local partnership. We've seen that with the end of revenue sharing in the 1980s. In the 1990s, some of us remember Newt Gingrich's Contract with America I worked for someone in New York City at the time who used to refer to it as the contract on America. And we saw unanimous Republican opposition to what I would call problem-solving federalism under the Biden-Harris administration, both in terms of the funding that went to state and local governments under ARPA, and then the extraordinary resources that were made available under the IRA. And now, sort of the overview, the overarching description that the Trump administration has provided to its initial budget proposals has been revitalizing federalism. And it appears to be revitalizing federalism by eliminating funding for housing programs, eliminating funding for emergency management grants, shifting responsibility for certain functions of the EPA to the states, and going after the community development block grant. And of course, what we're hearing about today and what we're talking about today really is more of the same, right? I mean, seeing is this shift in costs to states that Gina described. And you know, it's reasonable for those of us who've served at the local level. And I was a city finance officer in Tennessee. Mark was a mayor in Missouri. Chris is a controller now in Texas. We all know the experience of local governments where when states catch a fiscal cold, local governments get pneumonia. So it'd be fair to expect that some of any additional costs that states would bear would wind up resulting in somehow it coming out of the local government's hide. And the other thing is, and I think all of the prior speakers did an excellent job of talking about this, you know, the economic impact here is real. All of the research points to the fact that because SNAP dollars go to folks who have lower incomes, the benefits wind up recirculating in the local economy, helping to drive the local economy. And if those benefits go away or reduced, that has this very clear impact at the community level, at the city level, at the county level, and at the state level. And I guess what I would say is that we need to talk about that, right? I think advocates need to talk about that in the context of really if members of Congress vote for the sorts of changes to SNAP, the sorts of reductions in federal support for SNAP that are being talked about, they're effectively leaving states and local governments with a choice. They're either going to cut services or they're going to have to increase local taxes. So, you know, if folks want to see this as, you know, the precursor to an increase in local property taxes, that might make it a little less popular with certain members of Congress. And it's a fair argument for folks to make. I think that it also goes to a question, and Danielle and Mark really pointed to this, right? There's this notion of, well, you know, this is really a state role and the cost should be borne by states. And Gina, I'm actually in your home state for a couple of days, your former home state here in New Jersey. There's actually a candidate for governor in New Jersey who's campaigning on the fact that if there are cuts to Medicaid, he'll step into the breach and pick up those costs. Well, that's not going to happen in every state. And Controller Hollins could talk about the degree to which the Texas legislature and the governor there may or may not be willing to do the same thing. And it's not going to happen in states where the economic challenges are greater than they might be in New Jersey. And it's not going to happen, and it's not a good deal for most states, right? Where if you look at data that the Rockefeller Institute of Government puts out on a regular basis, the balance of payments are such that states that get way more back from the federal government right now than they put in terms of revenue. And if you look at the top 10 states in terms of net cost, net balance of payments being to the advantage of the state. Donald Trump carried 8 of those 10. If you look at the places that are going to be hardest hit at the local level on these issues, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur from Toledo has done a great analysis showing that out of the 100 congressional districts with the lowest median household income, 55 of those were represented by Republicans in Congress. I think that there is an argument to be made here that Chris and Mark and Danielle have done a great job laying out in terms of not just why this is a bad idea morally, this is a bad idea in terms of food policy, this is a bad idea in terms of local and state economics and fiscal policy. And I think perhaps some folks in Washington will be thinking about this the way that some folks may have seen what I regarded as an unlikely article from Josh Hawley in the Times the other day saying we can't do Medicaid cuts for much of the same economic reasons that we've laid forth on SNAP. So let me stop there. Again, thanks to everybody who's been participating, and Gina, thanks for inviting.
Thank you. I'm gonna invite our panelists to go back on screen. I'm gonna stay off screen because of Wi-Fi issues. I want to address the timeline. Thank you, Jenny, for putting that in. But we understand that the House, remember that they're not just voting on SNAP, they're also voting on education, Medicaid, other very important programs that, again, do not operate in silos. It's all interrelated, but their goal is to be able to be done, House Republicans be able to be done with everything before Memorial break. So we will see what happens this week and what the timeline is supposed to be, but we will keep updating you. David, you made a very good point that I think what we keep hearing from Congress is that, well, states have surpluses to deal with cuts to all of these programs. I don't know if Mark or Controller Hollins or Danielle, can you explain how a surplus is it's not really a surplus, that really states and cities really don't have surpluses, but they're more like rainy funds?
I'd be happy to weigh in on that. A lot of what is done in budgeting and the Volcker Alliance and Dick Ravitch and the budget program that they did a few years ago highlights this. But the way that those budget surpluses are put together doesn't include a lot of real costs, costs of infrastructure and so forth. It is done in a way that isn't exactly smoke and mirrors, but it isn't. It doesn't reflect the actual, real economic circumstance of the state. And if I'm able to sort of cobble things together using one-time revenues and fund balance and so forth, and I get the numbers to come out even this year, that may mean that I didn't pay for things that need to be done down the road. It's as if I balanced my household budget by not fixing the roof when it needs to be fixed and not fixing the sewage when it needs to be fixed. It's not real.
Yeah, the term in the trade that all of us are very aware of is most state governments, most local governments really have these structural budget deficits, right? That if you may look okay in year one, but if you take the trouble of looking at years 2, 3, 4, and 5, it doesn't look so good. And even for state governments or local governments, or in bond terms, right, they're AAA rated state and local governments. You know, part of the surpluses that they've been running have been driven by some of the dollars that they've gotten from the federal government. That is, as Mark pointed out, and I think Controller Hollins pointed out, those dollars are going away, right? And many of the well-off state and local governments are facing this sort of fiscal cliff. And the ones that Danielle's worked with over time and that I've worked with over time, they never had even those one-time surpluses, right? And Danielle talked about the great example. I know we were asked about rural counties. Some of these places, the slightest tweak in local revenue can push them over the edge.
Thank you. Well said. And I really appreciate it, Mark, is the roof needs to be fixing, it's leaking, but I'm saving money by not fixing it, which is not make sense. So I think that really breaks it down because there are many things and needs that our states need and municipalities. Danielle, this question, and for any of you who want to jump in, is how will these cuts to SNAP impact seemingly unrelated services like you mentioned, like fixing potholes, and other things? And I think David and Mark sort of touch on this, but Danielle, can you expand about how all of this will impact seemingly unrelated services?
Absolutely. So I think David just reflagged it, but if we look at most places' cash flow, particularly smaller and rural places, where the ability to purchase a vehicle or their ability to invest in an even moderately priced investment or piece of equipment can be detrimental depending on the timing of the year, when property taxes have been collected, the amount in which those taxes have come in. And so if there is even a slight margin of change in sales tax and property tax, municipalities' ability to maintain very basic services. And when I say the services today, that may not be ideal service levels. That maintain today's service levels, and that may not be the same as the ideal service level or even the standard of service for many types of local government departmental services, whether that's public safety or parks or whatever else it is. And so the cuts to these types of programs and their ripple effect on a local elected official's ability to find dollars to fill a pothole, to provide a new vehicle for a police officer, to hire or retain staff is going to be really critical. And I think there's just more of an impact beyond the individual family that folks will have to keep in mind and be cognizant of, particularly because most places, especially if they're economically challenged and smaller, don't have the capability or the capacity to think about that multi-year funding perspective or that financial picture that David highlighted. So their only view is a month-by-month or a year-by-year view of how much dollars are in the bank today and can I afford to make payroll and make sure that these services are being provided in the moment. Having a much farther outlook is a challenge. It's a challenge for high-functioning, affluent communities, and it's especially a challenge for economically challenged places. And so this would only exacerbate folks' ability to have a really strong understanding of the day-to-day finances, but as well as what the finances would look like next year or the year after that.
Sorry, wrong button. Thank you, Danielle, for that overview. Really helpful in terms of thinking about this. Can the three of you really talk about these impacts will be felt as a whole as for the states and really trickle down to communities? There's a difference with rural communities or smaller cities who have less revenue, less property taxes. And we hear a lot about protecting our rural communities, protecting our small communities. What in reality is this going to impact?
Well, I think go ahead, David. Go ahead.
I mean, I think Danielle talked about this, right? And we talked about this a little bit. On the fiscal side, right? If you were to, Gina, I know you shared with us some material that FRAC has put together, looking at sort of the percentage of households by county where you've got SNAP recipients. And Controller Hollins did a great job citing that data for Harris County, 600,000 people in one county, my gosh, right? But if you look at rural communities, I think you'll see a lot of cases where on a percentage basis, at the county level, the percentage of residents is super high. And if all of a sudden you're pulling that financial resource out from under 20% of a population or 30% or 40% of a population, because those resources are so integral to the local economy, that's going to have an impact on the overall revenues for that community. And again, as Danielle said, a lot of these rural communities, right? I think there are about 440 counties across the United States that are persistent poverty counties, right? So they've had 20% or more poverty for, I think, Danielle, it's 30 years or more. Those are the ones that are going to get impacted. Those are the ones on a fiscal basis that are going to get tipped over by the loss of these sorts of resources. The one other thing I'll say is, remember, right, the reason you had a McGovern-Dole partnership on this was a lot of these rural communities really benefit from the SNAP program because they're farm communities producing some of the food that goes into the SNAP program. That was a whole reason that you had Bob Dole, as a senator from Kansas, as such a huge advocate for this.
Thank you, David, for really putting. Go ahead, Mark.
Communities, the margin for error is just smaller. You know, they're more fragile. I think Danielle made that point very well. I mean, just the cost of a new vehicle is a big deal.
Well, thank you all so much. I don't see any further questions, but I will say to our participants that they're back. They're going to keep voting on this. It doesn't mean that it's a done deal. Maybe we'll finish with this, David and Mark, because I know that we are facing, it feels like this perfect trifecta to really impact and cut down these items, but it's not the first time we faced this, right? 2017, 2005, there was also a GOP trifecta that sought to cut down these things. Can you leave us with some final words about how we can galvanize in the particularly elected officials or government officials who understand these impacts to really speak up, and what individuals should know, that we don't necessarily have to cut these programs? And I'll end with this, that SNAP responds to the economy. You fix the economy, you offer individuals jobs, and individuals are not on SNAP, right? The number one reason that individuals go on SNAP is because they lose wages, reduce wages. The second reason is because a household member is ill. And the average time that individuals are on SNAP is 6 to 24 months. The latest data report from Job is that 5.1 million individuals have reduced job hours and want more full and permanent jobs, but they are not enough jobs. So let's fix the economy, let's fix accessibility, and individuals who do not want to be on SNAP because of the stigma and all of these conversations that are happening can be able to afford the basic needs that everyone needs. So David and Mark, any final thoughts on like this historical battles that we have seen before we end?
Well, I'll jump in and I'll say this, that so I had the great privilege of being mayor during the Great Recession, and it was a lot of fun. But the difference is that, you know, we had, for most of that time, we had a president, Obama, who was sympathetic and trying to help. And we had programs with regular calls with local governments, chaired by then Vice President Joe Biden, about how they could help. And so there was a much different relationship between local governments and the national government. Of course, we complained. And we complained that they put too much of the money through the state, and the state creamed off a lot of it instead of giving it to us. But still, it was not what I would call a hostile relationship at all. What you have now is a hostile relationship. You have what I call fend for yourself federalism. Basically, local governments are on their own. And from a political perspective, I just wrote something about this a couple of days ago, but you have a bunch of mayoral primaries going on now, especially in New York City. And these candidates are all talking about more. They're going to do more child care. They're going to do more affordable housing. They're going to do more public safety. Somebody needs to ask them how they're going to do less, because they're going to have less money to deliver on those dreams. And so I think it would be those are good questions to ask local officials and candidates, but also some candidate. I mean, the reason I got elected, how does an auditor win a mayor's race? It was because I was straight with people about the financial troubles that they were going to be facing, and they believed me. You could separate yourself from the crowd in the mayoral election by telling the truth about the finances.
So I'll say a couple of things in addition to, as I usually do, agreeing with everything Mark just said. I mean, I think there are a couple of things, right? There are members of the House of Representatives on both sides of the aisle that have sat in at the table for local government. They've been county commissioners, they've been local members of council, they've been mayors, right? Go find them, go talk to them and tell them, hey, this is what we've heard is going to happen, not just to the people who are dependent on these benefits, but what's going to happen to the communities. You know, you've sat in that seat where you've had to make tough budget cuts because as a former local government official, I always like to point out while I was in the White House, we actually had to balance our budget. And those are the realities that these people understand. The second thing I'll say is, Gina, I really appreciate your doing this. I think what Controller Holland said, what Mark said, I hope what I said and what Danielle said is a different way of talking about this issue. If you've got a local controller, if you've got a local city auditor or county auditor, ask them, right? Ask them to say what the impact is going to be like in your community. You know, you heard it from Controller Hollins today. Brad Lander, who's one of those candidates running in New York City, is the city controller. He did a great report at the end of last year saying, here's what's at risk in terms of cuts to the federal government. It is a legitimate question for you all at the community level to turn to your local elected officials and say, take a position, don't take a position. Tell us, right, with the honesty that Mark talked about that he was able to win on, tell us what's going to happen here locally. That's going to give you the ammunition you need to talk to any member of Congress.
Very helpful. One last question, David. Can you repeat the source for the individual from Toledo that you referenced earlier?
Yeah, I think somebody answered already. It was Marcy Captor. And Gina, I'll send you the piece. I wrote a piece called Washington's War on Local Government. It cites both Marcy's study and the Rockefeller Institute study that I talked about.
Wonderful. Controller Hollins, Mark, Danielle, David, thank you so much for this very pivotal, timely information. To you who joined us today, thank you for caring about this issue. I will follow up with specific talking points and all the resources and the sites to what I talked about in terms of rates so that you can utilize that. And please, my email will be there. If you want to talk about how to tailor that with specific county and city data, please do not hesitate to reach out. I know everyone's exhausted, but it's all hands on deck. It's a lot easier to prevent any sort of programmatic changes than it is to try to claw back. The perfect example is the expansion and the creation of time limits were instituted in 1996, making individuals 18 to 49 be cut off from SNAP for only three months within a 3-year period if they couldn't show enough hours. 2023, it was expanded to those who were 54. What we're facing now is to those who are almost 64, and also to individuals who have children who are older than 7 years old. This opened the door for these constant changes. So please continue to join us and call your member of Congress, talk to your controller. They speak the same language. You need to balance the budget. Thank you all for joining us. And again, thank you to our amazing panelists for that very valuable information. And let's keep at it. Thank you all. Take care.